1 decade. 1 missing prime minister. 1 vote that changed a nation. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Australia helped put a man on the moon. This is the 1960s, and it's wilder than anything you learned in school. At the start of the decade, Australia was still run by one man who'd held power for 16 years straight, still loyal to Britain, still shutting its doors to non-white migrants, under a law with a chillingly honest name, the White Australia Policy. By the end of the decade, that same country had drafted its own sons into a war using a lottery of birthdays. It had voted almost unanimously to finally count Aboriginal Australians as citizens who mattered. It had ripped up its currency and started over. And its prime minister had walked into the ocean. And never walked back out. This is a decade of contradictions, old power clinging on, while young people revolted, cruel laws finally cracking, and a nation forced to decide who it really wanted to be. Stick with me, we're going deep into Australia, in the 1960s, no fluff, just what actually happened. 1. Leadership turmoil. In 1960, Robert Menzies was already the most powerful man in Australian politics, and had been since 1949. By the time he finally stepped down in January 1966, he'd governed for 16 unbroken years, still the longest run of any prime minister in Australian history, before or since. His successor, Harold Holt, took over promising a fresher, more modern Australia. He lasted less than 2 years. On December 17, 1967, Holt went swimming at Cheviot Beach near Portsea, Victoria, a beach known for dangerous rips. He waded in, and simply never came back out. Search parties, divers, and the Royal Australian Navy searched for days. Nothing, no body was ever recovered. To this day, his disappearance remains one of Australia's strangest unsolved mysteries, and it even spawned wild conspiracy theories, including one claiming he was secretly collected by a Chinese submarine. With no prime minister and no time to waste, Country Party leader John McEwen stepped in as caretaker for 23 days, just long enough to stop the government from collapsing into chaos. Then, in January 1968, John Gorton was elected to the top job by his own party. Unlike Menzies and Holt, Gorton was Australian-born and proud of it, pushing for Australia to stop leaning so heavily on Britain and start acting like an independent nation making its own decisions. 3 prime ministers, 1 drowning mystery, 1 caretaker government, and through every bit of that chaos the same party, the coalition, never lost its grip on power. 2. The Vietnam War and conscription. Imagine being 20 years old in Australia in the mid-1960s. Your birthday gets pulled out of a barrel on national television, live, using marbles. And just like that, you're now legally required to go fight in a war on the other side of the world. This wasn't rare, it wasn't a rumor, it was real government policy. Australia's involvement started small military advisors sent to South Vietnam from 1962, under Menzies, to support the anti-communist government there. But by April 1965, Menzies had committed a full combat battalion, and Australia was officially at war alongside the United States. To fill the ranks, the government passed the National Service Scheme in 1964. Every young man's birthdate went into a lottery ballot. If your birthday came up, you were conscripted, no volunteering required, no way to opt out, unless you had specific exemptions. Roughly 15,000 conscripted Australians would eventually serve in Vietnam, and 200 of them never came home. As the death toll and news footage rolled in, public support cracked. By 1970, moratorium marches were pulling in over 100,000 protesters in Melbourne alone, one of the largest protest movements Australia had ever seen. Draft resistors were jailed, families argued at dinner tables, universities became hotbeds of dissent. Vietnam didn't just test Australian soldiers in the jungle. It tested the entire country's trust in its own government, and by the end of the decade, that trust was badly broken. 3. The 1967 referendum, a turning point. Here's something that stuns a lot of people today. Before 1967, Aboriginal Australians weren't fully counted as part of the nation's official population, and the federal government had no direct constitutional power to make laws for them at all. That power sat almost entirely with individual state governments, and state laws varied wildly, with some allowing serious discrimination in wages, movement, and basic rights. So on May 27, 1967, Australia held a referendum. Voters were asked to approve 2 changes to the constitution: remove a clause excluding Aboriginal people from the census, and let the federal parliament make laws specifically for Aboriginal Australians, just like it could for any other group. The results stunned even its own campaigners. Over 90.77% of Australians voted yes, the highest yes vote ever recorded in an Australian referendum, before or since. Every single state passed it. This came after years of grassroots pressure, led largely by activists like Faith Bandler, and organizations pushing for a decade to get this vote onto the ballot at all. But here's the part most people skip. The referendum didn't create new rights on its own. It simply gave the federal government the power to act. Real practical change like the 1976 Aboriginal Land Rights Act still took years to follow. Still, 1967 was the moment Australia officially admitted, on paper and by near total public agreement, that Aboriginal Australians belonged in the national count. The real test was whether the country would back that vote with real action. 4. Racism and Aboriginal rights in action. The 1967 referendum looked great on paper. But out on the streets, real life for Aboriginal Australians told a very different story. In February 1965, a group of Sydney University students climbed onto a bus and drove straight into the heart of rural New South Wales. They called it the Freedom Ride, and it was led by a young Aboriginal activist named Charles Perkins, one of the first Aboriginal Australians to graduate from university. What they found shocked the nation. In towns like Moree and Walgett, Aboriginal Australians were banned from public swimming pools, turned away from RSL clubs, and forced to sit in separate sections of cinemas. This wasn't some story from the American South. This was happening in Australia, in 1965, and most white Australians had no idea. Then, in August 1966, another act of defiance shook the country, but this time, it wasn't students, it was workers. At Wave Hill Cattle Station in the Northern Territory, Gurindji stockman Vincent Lingiari led roughly 200 Aboriginal workers off the job. They were paid a fraction of what white workers earned, and treated as second-class labour on land that had been theirs long before any station existed. What started as a walk-off over wages grew into something bigger, a demand for the land itself back. The strike dragged on for 8 long years, but it planted the seed for Australia's entire land rights movement. 2 events, 1 year apart. Both proved the same brutal point: a referendum could change the constitution, but it couldn't change what was happening on the ground overnight. 5. Social issues. Not every battle in 1960s Australia was fought in Parliament or on the streets. Some of the biggest changes crept in quietly, inside people's own homes. Take divorce. Through most of the decade, getting one in Australia was brutal. Couples had to prove fault, adultery, cruelty, desertion, often dragging private pain through public courtrooms. Unhappy marriages that should have ended stayed intact, simply because the legal system made leaving so hard. Then, in 1961, something arrived that would quietly reshape women's lives for good: the contraceptive pill. For the first time, women had real control over when or if they had children. It wasn't widely or easily available to everyone right away, and plenty of doctors and pharmacists still judged women who asked for it. But the door had been opened, and it would never fully close again. Meanwhile, Aboriginal Australians were still living under laws that controlled basic parts of their lives: where they could work, how much they were paid, even where they were allowed to live, depending on the state. The 1967 referendum was a milestone, but it didn't erase these laws overnight, and underneath all of it, a generational rift was tearing open. Parents who trusted the government, respected authority and believed in doing your duty, now had children who were burning draft cards, marching in the streets, and questioning everything their parents held sacred. By the end of the decade, Australian homes looked calm on the outside. Inside, everything was shifting. 6. Immigration. Walk down an Australian street in 1969 and you'd hear something you rarely heard in 1959: languages that weren't English. After World War II, Australia had launched a massive immigration push, worried that a small population left the country dangerously exposed. That push was still in full swing by the 1960s, and it was reshaping the nation faster than most people realized. Under assisted passage schemes, migrants from Britain came first, and in huge numbers. But right behind them came waves of Italians and Greeks, fleeing poverty and rebuilding their lives in cities like Melbourne and Sydney. By the end of the decade, Melbourne had one of the largest Greek populations of any city on Earth outside Greece itself. Entire suburbs transformed: new grocery stores, new churches, new cafes, new sounds and smells that hadn't existed there a decade earlier. But here's the part most people don't know. For almost the entire decade, this immigration wave was still filtered through the White Australia policy, a law that, bluntly, favoured white European migrants and shut out almost everyone else. That finally started cracking in the late 1960s. Small, quiet changes let in a handful of non-European migrants for the first time in decades. It wasn't equality, it wasn't even close, but it was the first real crack in a wall that had stood since Federation in 1901. By 1970, Australia looked less like a leftover slice of Britain, and more like a genuine mix of cultures, even if the law hadn't fully admitted it yet. 7. Emigration. While hundreds of thousands of migrants were arriving in Australia, a smaller, less told story was happening in the opposite direction. Some Australians were packing up and leaving. Britain remained the emotional mother country for many Australians well into the 1960s, and for some, that pull went both ways. Young professionals, artists and academics left for London, chasing bigger opportunities, better funded universities, and a cultural scene that still felt more exciting than anything Australia offered at the time. One of the most famous examples came from music. The Bee Gees' three brothers, who'd actually grown up in Australia after emigrating from England as children, reversed course entirely, moving back to the UK in 1967 to chase global stardom. It worked. Within a year they were competing with the Beatles on the pop charts. Australian actors, writers and academics followed similar paths, frustrated by a local scene that often felt too small, too conservative, or too disconnected from where the real cultural action was happening. This created a strange, two-way population shift most textbooks skip entirely. At the exact same moment Australia was absorbing enormous waves of European migrants, it was also quietly losing some of its own talent to bigger stages overseas. It wasn't a mass exodus, nothing close to the scale of immigration flowing in. But it revealed something honest about Australia in the 1960s. For all its growth, plenty of ambitious young Australians still felt they had to leave home to make it big. 8. Population growth. Here's a number that tells you everything about how fast Australia was changing in the 1960s. By the end of the decade, the population had climbed past 12 million, up from around 10 million just 10 years earlier. That's roughly 2 million new people in a single decade. And it wasn't coming from one source, it was coming from two directions at once. The first was immigration, which we've already covered, waves of British, Italian and Greek migrants pouring into Australian cities. The second was something quieter, but just as powerful: the tail end of the baby boom. Australian families in the 1950s and early 1960s were still having children at a high rate, and those babies were now flooding into primary schools and eventually high schools, by the thousands. This double engine of growth, immigrants arriving and babies being born, put massive pressure on Australian cities. Suburbs that didn't exist in 1959 were full, established communities by 1969. New schools had to be built practically overnight. Housing development spread further and further from city centres, chewing up farmland on the outskirts of Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. It's easy to talk about the 1960s in terms of politics and protests. But underneath all of that, Australia was physically growing at a pace it had never experienced before, and every part of daily life, from classrooms to roads to housing, had to scramble to keep up. 9. Money, decimal currency and economic boom. On the morning of February 14, 1966, Australians woke up, and their money had changed overnight. For over a century, Australia had used the British system of pounds, shillings and pence, a confusing setup, where 12 pence made a shilling, and 20 shillings made a pound. On that single day it was scrapped entirely and replaced with a clean, simple decimal system, dollars and cents. The government ran a massive public education campaign to make the switch land smoothly, including a now famous jingle to teach people the new system. It worked. Within weeks most Australians had adjusted, and the changeover is still considered one of the smoothest currency transitions in modern history. But money wasn't just changing form, it was also multiplying. At the same time as the currency switch, Australia was riding a genuine mining boom. Massive iron ore deposits were being discovered and developed in Western Australia's Pilbara region, while Queensland's bauxite and nickel deposits were drawing serious international investment. This wasn't replacing Australia's old economy, it was stacking on top of it. Wool and wheat exports, the backbone of Australian trade for generations, were still strong. But now mining was rising up right alongside them, quietly setting the stage for a shift that would define Australia's economy for the rest of the century. New currency in people's pockets, new wealth coming out of the ground. By the end of the 1960s, Australia's economy looked and felt genuinely different from the one it had 10 years earlier. 10. Cars. By the late 1960s, if you wanted to know what Australia was proud of, you didn't need to look at Parliament. You just needed to look at the driveway. Car ownership exploded across the decade, and one car in particular became a genuine national symbol, the Holden. Built by an Australian arm of General Motors, Holden had already been marketed for years as Australia's own car, and by the 1960s that slogan felt true. Families saved for years to buy one. Owning a Holden wasn't just about transport, it was a statement that you'd made it into the middle class. In 1968, Holden released the HK series, including the now legendary Monaro, a car built with genuine muscle, competing directly against Ford's rising Falcon GT. This sparked one of Australia's fiercest and longest-running rivalries, Holden versus Ford, a battle that would define Australian car culture and Australian motorsport for decades to come. But cars weren't just about pride and competition, they physically reshaped how Australians lived. As more families owned vehicles, cities could sprawl outward instead of staying packed tightly around train lines and tram routes. New suburbs sprang up on the edges of Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, places that only made sense if every household had a car in the garage. Petrol stations, drive-in cinemas and roadside diners multiplied to serve this new, mobile way of life. The car wasn't just a machine anymore. It was reshaping the physical map of the entire country, one new suburb at a time. 11. Fashion. In 1965, if a young Australian woman walked down the street in a miniskirt, she wasn't just making a fashion choice. She was making a statement, and older generations noticed immediately. The miniskirt, popularised by British designer Mary Quant, crossed into Australia mid-decade, and landed like a small earthquake. Hemlines climbed higher than anything seen before, and it triggered genuine public debate. Newspaper columns, worried parents, and school uniform policies, all scrambling to respond to a garment that suddenly felt rebellious just by existing. Men's fashion was shifting too, just less loudly. Hair grew longer, collars got bolder, and color choices that would have seemed outrageous in the buttoned-up 1950s. Bright florals, wide ties, patterned shirts started showing up on regular Australian men, not just musicians or artists. But Australia's fashion story wasn't only borrowed from London. Surf culture was carving out something genuinely local. Board shorts, thongs, the footwear, not underwear, a very Australian distinction. And casual beachwear stopped being just beach clothes and started becoming everyday fashion, especially among young people in coastal cities like Sydney and Perth. This mattered more than it might sound. Fashion in the 1960s wasn't just about looking good, it was one of the clearest, most visible signs of the generational divide splitting Australian households. A miniskirt or a pair of thongs worn to the wrong occasion could spark a genuine argument at the dinner table. What you wore had become a way of saying who you were, and who you weren't. 12. Music. In June 1964, Sydney and Melbourne experienced something close to genuine mass hysteria. The Beatles had arrived, and Australian teenagers lost their minds. Screaming crowds packed streets and hotel balconies just to catch a glimpse of the band. Police struggled to control the chaos. For many young Australians, it was the first time global pop culture had landed on their doorstep in person, rather than just through a radio speaker. But Australia wasn't only consuming overseas music, it was starting to produce its own. In 1966, a Sydney band called the Easy Beats released Friday on My Mind, a song that didn't just top Australian charts. It cracked the British and American markets too, becoming one of the first genuinely successful Australian rock exports. Then there were the Gibb brothers, three siblings who'd grown up in Australia after emigrating from England as children. Performing as the Bee Gees, they built a following locally through the mid-1960s before making the bold decision to move back to England in 1967, chasing a bigger stage. Within a year they were competing directly with the Beatles on the global charts. Radio stations across the country shifted almost entirely toward this new rock sound, pushing out the calmer pop and orchestral music that had dominated in the 1950s. For young Australians, music wasn't just entertainment anymore, it was identity, rebellion, and a direct line to a wider world that suddenly felt within reach. By the end of the decade, Australian music had gone from copying the world to genuinely competing with it. 13. Culture. By 1969, the average Australian family owned something that barely existed 20 years earlier, a television set glowing in the living room every single night. Television had arrived in Australia in 1956, but the 1960s is when it truly took over daily life. Local stations built their own drama series, variety shows and news programs, and by the end of the decade, TV had replaced radio as the main way Australians got their entertainment and information. Families gathered around one screen together, a shared national experience that hadn't really existed before. Underneath the television boom, something quieter was stirring. Early feminist consciousness. Australian women were reading imported works, questioning traditional roles, and small but growing numbers were pushing back against the assumption that marriage and motherhood were a woman's only path. This wouldn't fully explode into a movement until the 1970s, but the seeds were clearly being planted throughout the 1960s. Meanwhile, Australian cinema and theatre were stirring too, though slowly. Local filmmakers and playwrights began pushing against decades of relying almost entirely on British and American imports, testing out stories that felt distinctly Australian rather than borrowed. It wasn't a full creative explosion yet that would come in the 1970s with what's now called the Australian New Wave, but the early groundwork was being laid right here in the 1960s. Culturally, Australia was still looking outward, still consuming plenty from Britain and America. But for the first time in decades, it was also starting to look inward, and ask what an authentically Australian story even sounded like. 14. Sport and national pride. In October 1964, Australia sent its athletes to Tokyo for the Olympic Games, and came home with real reasons to celebrate. Betty Cuthbert, already a star from the 1956 Melbourne Games, added another gold medal to her name in Tokyo, cementing her status as one of Australia's greatest ever sprinters. Distance runner Ron Clarke didn't strike Olympic gold in Tokyo, but his relentless record-breaking performances throughout the decade made him one of the most respected middle and long-distance runners in the world, admired even by rivals who beat him. Tennis was producing its own rising star. By the late 1960s, a young Aboriginal Australian, named Yvonne Goolagong, was already turning heads with her talent, setting up what would become a legendary career in the following decade, and standing as a powerful symbol at a time when Aboriginal Australians were still fighting for basic recognition off the court. But Olympic glory and rising stars aside, everyday sport still ran on the same fuel it always had: cricket tests that stopped the nation over summer, fierce local rugby league rivalries in New South Wales and Queensland, and Australian rules football drawing massive passionate crowds in Victoria and South Australia. Sport in the 1960s wasn't just entertainment. It was one of the few things that could unite a country otherwise splitting over war, race, and generational change. Whatever else Australians disagreed about, cheering for their team or their country still brought them together. 15. Australia and the space race. While the world watched Neil Armstrong take his first steps on the moon in July 1969, few people realized Australia had a direct hand in making that moment possible. Throughout the 1960s, Australia built and operated tracking stations, specifically to support NASA's most ambitious missions. The Carnarvon Tracking Station in Western Australia played a key role during the Mercury and Gemini programs, helping monitor astronauts and spacecraft as they passed over the southern hemisphere, a stretch of the planet American stations simply couldn't cover alone. Then came the big one. The Honeysuckle Creek Tracking Station, built near Canberra and completed in 1967, wasn't just a supporting player during Apollo 11, it carried the exact signal for the moment Neil Armstrong's boot touched the lunar surface. NASA was switching between 3 stations trying to find the clearest picture, and in the seconds before that first step, they locked onto Honeysuckle Creek. For those first 9 minutes, it was Honeysuckle's signal the entire world was watching, before NASA switched to the larger Parkes telescope for the remaining 2 hours of the moonwalk. Think about that. At the single most watched moment in the entire broadcast, a quiet facility in the Australian bush was the reason the world got to see it happen live. This wasn't a small side project. It required serious technical expertise, international cooperation, and Australian engineers and scientists working at the absolute edge of what was technologically possible at the time. By the end of the 1960s, Australia wasn't just a nation dealing with war, protest, and social change on the ground. It had quietly become part of one of humanity's greatest achievements, reaching beyond the Earth itself. The decade that changed everything. 10 years. That's all it took. A prime minister who ruled for 16 years stepped aside, and his successor walked into the ocean and never came back. A nation that once refused to count Aboriginal Australians as part of its population turned around and voted, almost unanimously, to change that forever. Young men were drafted by birthday lottery to fight a war overseas, while young women quietly gained more control over their own lives than any generation before them. Migrants rebuilt Australian cities from the ground up, money changed overnight, cars reshaped entire suburbs. And somewhere in the middle of all this chaos, a trekking station in the Australian bush helped beam humanity's first steps on the moon to the entire world. This wasn't just a decade of events. It was the decade Australia stopped being a quiet copy of Britain and started becoming its own country, messy, divided, and constantly arguing with itself about who it wanted to be. And here's the truth. Every argument this country still has today about immigration, about Indigenous rights, about identity, it all traces straight back to these 10 years. So now I want to hear from you. Which of these moments hit you the hardest? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this took you somewhere you didn't expect, hit subscribe, because we're just getting started, and history like this deserves to be told properly.